It was in the latter days of October, so long ago that Queen Bess had been gone but 6 months. Abel Reed trudged over the Middlesex clays between Northolt and Greenford. Now, few men would have envied him the task that had taken him abroad that day, for he'd been collecting his debts. Many, however, might have envied him his success, because he was a man not easy to refuse, and his pouch was well filled. Nor had hospitality been wanting. He was one with whom it was well to be on good terms, and he had filled more than his purse before setting out for home, although it was beyond the power of good cheer to make him cheerful. There were times of what people are now pleased to call the good old winters. October still had a few days to run, and yet the ground was already hard with frost, and a full moon enabled the traveller to see his way clearly. But for that and the frost, the way must have been made longer by some 2 or 3 miles. Field paths in Middlesex are not for all seasons. But Abel took this good fortune ungratefully. His scheme of things contained no place for sentiment. He was the miller of Perivale, a man who lived alone in his mill, brooding alternately upon his rights and wrongs. And although millers are jolly by tradition, there was nothing jolly about this one. He'd just crossed the stile at the high road by the Greenford pound, when an unexpected sound brought him to a halt. The cry of a child close at hand. In another minute, he'd picked up a little woolen bundle from which the cry issued, and for the first time in his life, he found himself holding a baby in his hands. Looking this way and that, he called aloud, but no answer came. Even the cries of the child ceased, and there was no sound but the echo of his own voice. And so he carried the babe, which he held at arm's length, to Parson Gardner at the rectory, desiring only to be rid of it and to continue his journey homewards. Now, the rector's household had gone to rest, leaving him at his studies, and when the miller's knock disturbed him, he came to unbar the door, carrying his candle. Huh! An exclamation of surprise escaped him as the light fell on Abel Reed. "Why, Abel, what brings thee here at such an hour?" "Marry, sir, that which would have pleased me better if it had brought another. 'Tis a child I picked up by the pound. And art afraid of it biting, that thou must hold it thus? Bring it within to the fire. Let us examine it. 'Tis some trollop's babe, I fear, but well, a hearty boy none the less. Wilt thou take it for thine own, being the finder?" Nay, I want none such as this. I did but take it up for safety, being too pitiful a man to leave a babe on the ground this frosty night." "Well, 'twas well done," answered the rector, "and thou must do it the further kindness now to carry it across to Thalathiel Penny, who is overseer, and to tell him to put the babe with Goody Brandon at the charge of the parish. What sayest thou to a draught of ale?" "Nay, thank you," said Abel, "for I must get me home. Good night, rector." "Good night, then," said Gardner, "and Godspeed," upon which he closed the door and returned to his studies. "Pox on all children," muttered Abel as he trudged across to the overseer's house. "It's enough to make any man mind his own affairs and leave pity to others." But he delivered the foundling and the rector's message to Master Penny, and he set his face finally towards Perivale, his connection with his child, for all that he knew to the contrary, being finished and done with forever. And the overseer, on his part, carried the babe to Goody Brandon, whom he roused from her bed, and then, when midnight struck, the new-found infant and every other person concerned in this night's work, unless we are to accept the mother, was sound asleep. Now, Parson Michael Gardner, albeit a devoted student of the new learning, was nonetheless also a devoted pastor, and his first thought the next morning was of the child picked up by Abel Reed and of the poor mother who had deserted it. He went to the constable, only to find that he'd already searched the parish and found no trace of any wandering women. Nor, to conclude this part of the story, was any trace ever discovered thereafter. And so the rector went on to the overseer and had the child brought in to be made a Christian. "How shall we name the boy?" said the overseer. "Well, he was found on the feast of St. Simon and St. Jude," replied the rector, "so let him be called Simon. As for his surname, I must leave that up to you. How was the last foundling named?" The overseer turned to the book. "The last was left by a Lincolnshire woman who died on her journey. She came from Boston, and we gave the child that name, not knowing how the mother had been called." "Well then," said the rector, "let this one be Coston, since C follows B." The foundling was accordingly written down Simon Coston, and the rector, after giving him conditional baptism, returned to his books. Goody Brandon carried him back to the cottage in which he spent the rest of his boy life. And there we shall leave him while we pass in one stride over 15 years and place ourselves again with the miller at Perivale, who has somewhat more to do with our story in its next stage. Now, from what I've already told you of Abel Reed, it will be evident that he was little concerned to make his conversation pleasant. And as the years grew upon him, indeed, he showed a growing determination to make it unpleasant. More grey and more dour than when we last saw him, he stood upon the platform of his mill one day in the early part of the year, looking upon the land about him, which he had gradually made his own. A little old woman emerged from a thicket carrying a bundle of wood, a person, if it were possible, less liked and more feared than the miller himself. It was the day of witches, you see, and Dame Giggs was reputed to be one of them, and indeed she looked the part. The miller shouted to her as she passed beneath him, "Whose wood art carrying away now, mistress?" She answered him without looking up. "Since when is a poor woman upbraided for gathering a few sticks?" "Yet the sticks are mine and not thine," called out the miller. "Lay them down." "Just grudge me then an armful of firewood," she responded. "My grudging is of no concern of thine. It's enough that I gave thee no leave. Now lay them down. Wooding is for them that will, and always has been. Am I to go fireless because thou art a miser?" "Lay them down," shouted Abel, "or I'll take the longest and lay it about thy back and have thee put in the stocks." The old lady threw her bundle on the ground and turned her wrinkled face to the miller. "Have me in the stocks, forsooth. Thou'lt sooner have thyself where 'tis worse. Thou'rt the devil's man, and fit for his company and no better. And thou fall not off that staging and break thy neck, thou'lt drown near the dam, or get thy ugly body twixt thy own millstones. Never wilt thou die in thy bed, Abel Reed, for thy master's not want to wait for that. I'll leave thee thy faggots. Better be as cold a home as mine is than as warm as thine is like to be." The miller made no reply, but spat on the ground and turned into his mill, whilst Dame Griggs trudged down the road. Now, the sturdy, whistling lad of 15, who shortly came within sight, was Simon Coston, now grown to be a terror to all who could not take a boy's mischief in good part. And Dame Giggs, not without reason, detested all boys. "Why, dame," said the lad, "hast left thy broomstick at home?" "Good for thee, I have," was the answer, "or I might have laid it about thy back." "Oh, surely thou wouldst not beat a little boy, being not more than twice thy own size." "I'd beat thee till thou dost cry for mercy, thou imp of mischief. Hast no respect for age? I'll tell on thee to Master Gardner when I see him next." "Nay, dame, I have such respect for thy age that it pains me to see thee going afoot when thou mightest sail aloft on thy broomstick. Thou knowest thou art a witch, and all witches go thus. Rule thy tongue, thou graceless lad, or 'twill make thee trouble. And I be indeed a witch, this shall prove an ill meeting for thee. Thy grandam was a witch, and thy mother was a witch, and thou art the naughtiest witch of all. With this, he slipped deftly behind the dame, put his arms under hers, and clasping his hands across her breast, lifted her from the ground and whirled her 5 or 6 circles around. And then he set her down, giddy and breathless. She staggered to a tree for support, while Simon resumed his journey towards the mill, still whistling. Thou graceless loon, piped the old woman, thou'lt come to no good. Thou comest into the world amiss, thou'rt going through it amiss, and amiss wilt thou leave it. The boy waved his hand in reply as he passed out of earshot, and the dame went unsteadily on to her cottage. Now, it was an ill day for each of them, and no less for the miller. The boy and he repeated to each other as much as Dame Giggs had said, and perhaps somewhat more, all of which within a few days Simon had circulated freely in 3 parishes. The boy enjoying his tale so much that he failed to observe the seriousness with which others received it. You see, witches were held in great fear, and it was an unwelcome thought that there might be one at work so close at hand. Within a few days of her encounter with the miller, Dame Giggs found herself in need of a hoe for the weeding of her bit of garden. So she made her way to a kindly neighbour who had done her many little services in the past. The neighbour opened his door in answer to her knock, but had no sooner set eyes upon the old woman than he hastily shut the door again and barred it, making his way to an upper window from which he bade her begone. Since when, asked Dame Giggs, have old neighbours lost their welcome? Since they have laid curses upon honest folk, said the man, and trafficked with the devil to do them hurt. Well, upon the same day it happened that Simon Coston took his rod to angle in the River Brent. It was Candlemas and a holy day, and as he set out, he looked for company for his sport. 2 sons of a shepherd living near the stream had often shared his pastimes, and to the shepherd's house now he betook himself. Their mother stood near the door and called loudly and hurriedly as Simon approached. Away with thee, boy! There's naught more to be between us and you. Naught more, said Simon. Why, am I out of favour on some account? Aye, that thou art. Dame Giggs hath laid a spell upon thee, and my lad shall be drawn into no such doings as that. Get thee gone. Well, it was a day or 2 later when the miller went to the Coach and Six for a draught of ale. 2 or 3 men sitting by the tap made a hurried exit before Abel reached the door, at which the landlord met him. I'd as lief not have thee under my roof, Abel, he said. Thou mayst take thy drink outside. Outside? Said Abel angrily. What possesses thee to talk thus? Nay, replied the landlord, 'tis thou that art possessed, as the world know. I'll have no neighbouring with thee. You see, from this it will be seen that Dame Giggs was being taken seriously. Now, the cruelties practiced upon witches in former days are matters of common knowledge. Some of these were sanctioned by law, and others sanctioned only by usage and condoned. All of them, however, are familiarly known and came to be frequently suggested by one and another as fitting treatment for Dame Giggs. The gentler minds would have her weighed against the church Bible. The ruder sort spoke of trying her by water or having her hanged without more ado. And yet, however, there was nothing laid to her charge but words, and words were not a hanging matter, even with witches. The threats that she had uttered against the miller and the boy remained part of the common talk, and frequent repetition multiplied and embellished them by no means to the dame's advantage, but of consequences there were none. Simon was still as lusty as ever and as careless, and the miller, to the general wonder, went about his usual business without coming to harm. None were willing to believe that Dame Giggs had no alliance with the Prince of Darkness, but some were beginning to allow that she had failed in practice. And it was at this juncture that Abel Reed disappeared. The door of the mill stood barred, and days passed without any sight of him. Now, he was not one with whose concerns it was well to take liberties, but when one after another came for flour and could get none, it became necessary to obtain entrance to the mill and see what was doing. It fell to the lot of an active young carter to climb to the upper stage and explore. A cry, piteous to hear, followed his entrance, and some of those who waited were soon by his side. Now, what they saw, and was described with morbid satisfaction at many a fireside the next day when the children had gone to bed. I have no wish to dwell upon the horrible details, but bruised fragments of the miller's body had been found entangled with shreds of his clothing, and it was obvious that he had been ground in his own mill with such completeness as hardly permitted of a decent burial. And no one could doubt that Dame Giggs was the cause of it. Well, there was a great funeral. Abel Reed's death had procured him more friends than he'd ever made in his life. And as soon as he was laid in the churchyard, they became his avengers. They set out in a great company to find Dame Giggs and deal with her, as was the manner with witches. The dame was in her cottage, sitting over the remains of a fire. She looked up at the crowd that entered the door. "Who are ye that press into a woman's house unasked?" "Who we are is no concern of thine," said the leader of the party. "What we are come for, thou shalt soon learn." "Look how she sitteth in her black cap," said another. "She looketh as witches ever do." "I'm as much a witch as ye are men of sense," said the dame. "As for that, we shall make a trial of thee. Thou shalt be swum." Oh yes, a noble sport. "If I sink not, I'm a witch, and if I sink, I'm a corpse. You call that a trial or an execution?" "Trial and execution all are one for such as thou. Let's bind her and have done with it." Well, the dame made no resistance. In fact, what resistance could she or her feeble body have made? The men stripped her of her clothing, and with her garters bound around her right hand to her left foot and her left hand to the other. This done, they wrapped her in a sheet, which they tied a length of cord to, and bore her to a deep pool at no great distance from the place. Their leader made a knot on the cord's end and held it in his hand, and when he gave the word to throw, two others set the sheet swinging and flung it forward. There was a horrible scream, succeeded by a splash, and the dame fell into the water a good cord's length from the shore. "She sinks! She swims! No, she sinks!" As these cries were uttered, it was hard to say which was true, but as the sheet lost its air, the poor creature undoubtedly disappeared beneath the surface. Now, this being a proof of innocence was disconcerting to the crowd. They awaited her reappearance in vain. They grew uneasy, and at last they called upon the leader to haul her in. And then occurred a new mishap. The sheet had been imperfectly bound up, and the cord drew it in by a single corner empty. There were cries for drags, poles, and other things not to be had. The pond was very deep, and no man dared to enter it. I mean, there was no reappearance of the dame's body, and after much idle clamour, the men gradually dispersed, none of them willing to be found upon the scene. Now, it does not concern us. The manner in which their leader was formally but leniently tried for homicide. The public opinion of the day condoned his offence, and he escaped with an insincere reprimand and a trifling penalty. No, our concern now is with Simon Coston, who got wind of the sport, as he called it, only as some of the men were returning home. He ran over the fields to the now deserted pond, which it was almost too dark to see, and he sat upon the last stile to recover his breath and decide whether or not he should go further. Now, of what had occurred then, we only have his own account. There were no witnesses, and the darkness gathered quickly. But his story, in his own words, was as follows. My master would give me no leave to attend Abel Reed's burial, saying that I'd been remiss of late. For this cause I had no news of the design to swim Dame Giggs, or I would have escaped from my task to see it, for swimming a witch is lawful sport. But when I was set free and heard of the matter, I made all speed to the pike pool, and found no man there, for the daylight was almost gone, so I could not learn whether the dame had withstood her trial. Being in a great heat with running, I sat by the stile looking upon the pike pool, which lies halfway down the field, and I felt great anger towards my master, who'd caused me to be late for the swimming. It was just growing dark, but there was light enough to see the pool, all still and quiet, and I sat and looked upon it without drawing near, being minded to get me home again, where my supper waited. But methought it would be a pleasant thing to cast a stone into the pool. It was a long cast, and I sought for a good round pebble to make it more surely, for it is a delight to disturb still water. And when I'd found my pebble and poised it for the throw, I saw the water moved, without the pebble leaving my hand. It seemed that some living thing had risen in the middle of the pool and then moved slowly to the land. Although it was large for a dog, methought it must be a dog, and I poised my stone afresh and waited. It was becoming too dark to see afar off, but methought that this animal was climbing out of the pool in my direction. I was not without dread, but was ashamed to flee, and so I held my stone poised and stood peering into the gloom. That which came into sight anon, near where I stood, turned me sick and cold. It was none other than Dame Giggs, her limbs bare, and her body overhung with slime and weeds from the pool. "Art alive, Dame?" I called out, although she was now close at hand. She gave no answer, but looked at me as she came along, and I saw that her face was dead. Whereupon I dropped the pebble from my hand and leapt the stile, and then ran my fleetest way home. Now, that was Simon's account as he delivered it to Rector Gardner, and as the latter put it down in writing at the time. The one addition which we have to record is that Dame Giggs's body was vainly sought in the pool the next day to be given the Christian burial to which the terrible issue of her trial had entitled her. The most determined attempts were made to find her, and all failed. As for Simon's story, there were few that believed it. The mill at Perivale, meanwhile, stood idle and soon fell into disrepair. There began to be stories about it, such as made men unwilling to live and work there. They said that it was cursed and haunted and doomed, and as time passed, its appearance came to match its reputation. By day, even in the softest wind, there were creakings of loose woodwork, and by night, the noises of bats and owls. Even in broad daylight, there were few who did not hasten their steps as they passed by. But eventually the mill did come to be occupied. An aged Jew out of London, contemptuous of the superstitions of country folk, took up his abode there, well content that the mill should be of ill repute, since the reputation afforded him an inexpensive lodging. Now, this man was called by no name. People knew him merely as the Jew. And the stories which soon became current about him eclipsed even those about his abode. None of them omitted to describe him as a miser of enormous wealth, and many contained lurid accounts of the manner in which that wealth had been obtained. Now, it served his purposes to be an object of awe to his neighbours, and although the bolder amongst the youth, one of whom was Simon Coston, would throw stones at his shutters, he was mostly feared and left alone. One day, however, to Simon's astonishment, as he passed by the mill, the Jew stood upon the platform and accosted him. "Prithee, boy," he called. "What's your will?" said Simon as he halted and looked up. "Canst get me a coney?" asked the Jew. "Wouldst have a live coney to play with, or a dead coney to eat?" "Bring me a coney to eat, dead or living, and thou shalt have its value," said the Jew. "Such as get conies from me," answered Simon, "must trust me with their value before I entrap them." "Thou art a wise youth," said the Jew, "and I love thee for it." And with that he threw 2 groats at Simon's feet. Well, it was generous payment, and Simon took a rabbit to the mill the next day, and then went to Hammersmith with the groats on Lammas Day to see a bear baited. It was the beginning of a sort of friendship with the Jew, which destroyed the remnant of Simon's reputation. I mean, the boy was never admitted into the mill, but he became the Jew's provider, and he soon acquired great skill in bargaining and no small profit in coin. But such friends as he retained regarded him now as lost, and since neither warnings nor threats moved him, he was in no long time as much shunned as the Jew himself. Those who felt kindly towards Simon regretted that the mill had not been burnt to the ground and done with. And this, it may be mentioned, was the fate commonly predicted for it, because the Jew was no niggard in candles, and the bright light that he kept about him was visible for long distances up until a late hour. All nights are alike, and no matter how late a traveller might be abroad, the Jew would be reported as still at his mischief, long after most honest folk had gone to their beds. After several months, his lights came to be as little remarkable as the stars themselves. What did cause a great deal of remark and conjecture, however, was the absence of the Jew's light upon a certain night in the autumn of 1620. A second night of darkness led to further excitement and surmise, and when that was followed by a third, the general curiosity reached bursting point, and a crowd gathered around the mill the next morning. Those who lived near at hand and were acquainted with the Jew's movements were sure that he remained in the mill, but none present showed any inclination to go inside. It had come to be regarded as most unholy ground. Now, all manner of suggestions had been made and scouted when someone said, "Let us fetch Simon Coston." Well, there was no dissent from this, and Simon was sent for. He came willingly enough. He had seen nothing of the Jew for a week or more. "Wilt go up into the mill, lad?" asked one of them. "Aye," said Simon, and he rapidly ascended the ladder while the crowd waited below. He didn't keep them waiting long. In a minute or so, the upper door was opened from the inside, and with a scared look, he appeared on the platform. "Away, quick!" he shouted. "The man who stays is lost! Get ye far away!" Upon this, to use the language of a tragedy then becoming popular, They stood not upon the order of their going, but went at once. One of them was positive that upon looking back, he saw the face of Dame Giggs looking over Simon's shoulder, but none who heard his cry wished to remain. That same night, a grazier who lived hard by heard a strange voice outside his shutters, and these were the words that it uttered: bury me ere you sleep, in Perivale churchyard 10 feet deep. Now the grazier who heard this did not sleep that night, but neither did he venture out to find the speaker. In the morning, the body of the Jew was discovered not far from the door, and Simon Coston was seen no more. It was commonly allowed that he had been made away with. You, however, shall be informed of facts unknown to any of the people on that day. Simon had found the Jew seated lifeless at his table, upon which was outspread a wealth of coins. Now, wishing to be master of such a situation, Simon had secured the flight of his company in the manner already described, and had carried out the body of the Jew to be discovered. That done, he made his way to St. Catherine's Dock and took his passage in the next hoy for Holland with a heavy leathern bag at his waist. Now, there was then a thriving linen trade with the Low Countries, into which Simon found his way, and to summarize this part of the story, within 4 or 5 years, he had become a prosperous merchant. Before a score of years had passed, he found himself master of a considerable fortune, with a wife and an increasing family, and then he determined that he would return to England and settle in his native place. About the manner of his reception by his old acquaintances, he thought little, and he might as well have thought nothing of it at all. Those who were his own age were humble folk, and of the elder who remembered his name, there were few who remembered it with any further interest. After an absence, therefore, of some 20 years, Coston took a ship to London with his family and his goods, and having lodged the former in the city, where his name was well known, he was not long in taking a horse to Perivale. He rode along the well-remembered lanes, chuckling over the adventures of his boyhood. The mill no longer stood, but the place in general was little changed. He drew rein and laughed aloud in the place where he'd laid hold of Dame Giggs and whirled her around. And then he recalled his adventure at the pond and allowed that he was mighty curious. But many eventful years had passed since then, and he had somewhat mistrustful of his own recollections. The reminiscence, however, served a more practical purpose, because he meant to build a house, and that field about the Pike Pool, as he remembered it, was an excellent site for such a thing. So he made up his mind to ride there again and see it. The field lay in the parish of Greenford, a bare mile away, and he turned his horse westward and cantered over the meadows. He was enjoying his ride, being a good horseman, and having discovered that he rode a good horse, borrowed though it was. He cantered easily over the level fields to Greenford, and he was soon within sight of the Pike Pool. He observed with pleasure that his recollection of the place had not deceived him. The land lay as conveniently as anyone could wish for the building of a house, and the pool could be left with its enclosure for the storing of fish. He rode on, measuring the ground with his eye, and suddenly his horse began to show signs of waywardness, and then abruptly stopped. Well, a touch of the whip sent him on a few yards forward, but then he stopped again and reared now, doing his best to turn around. Losing his temper somewhat, Simon used his spurs, and so he got the horse another dozen yards forward, but then he found himself pitched over the animal's head and lying on the ground. But he was not long in picking himself up, but he saw his horse galloping away towards Perivale, and its distance showed him that he must have, in fact, been down for some time. Well, there were no bones broken. He'd pitched upon a soft place and was no more than bruised. But there was a curious sensation of icy coldness about his left hand. The hand was resting on the ground, and he did not at once look at it. But when he did, oh, its appearance filled him with astonishment and disgust. Oh, it was covered in slime. Oily, loathsome slime, which conveyed the idea of decay and putrefaction and the touch of obscene reptiles. Oh, and as he brought it near his face, it smelled of fish scales and sick worms. I mean, he couldn't bring himself to touch this slime. He kept it at arm's length and scraped it off with a chip that lay near him. Now, Simon was no philosopher, and he was little apt to concern himself with the causes of things, yet he could not forbear looking about him for the hole into which chance must have thrust his hand. I mean, he looked at first only with curiosity, but then with impatience, and then with something not far removed from fear, because the turf around him, although soft and yielding, was nowhere broken and nowhere wet. You know, he trod all over the place of his fall. He tried every inch of it with his whip, and it proved to be sound everywhere alike. He was left with the preposterous conclusion that his left hand had become cold and slimy while it lay upon the warm and clean surface of the grass. As we've intimated, however, he was not a man to concern himself with speculation. He valued a conclusion chiefly because it brought the matter to a close, and in the present case, after another rapid examination of the site upon which he hoped to build his house, he set off in the direction taken by his horse, the more anxiously because it was not his own. In that matter, however, fortune favoured him. He soon came upon a labourer who had caught and fastened up the animal, and in this man's cottage he obtained the means, finally, of washing his hands clean, which done, he mounted the horse and set off towards the city. The horse was still excited and called for continued soothing and coaxing, but it regained confidence as they neared its home and stable in Bishopsgate, where its owner stood waiting for it. "I trust the nag hath carried thee to thy liking, friend Coston," was his greeting. "Carried me as far as it would," answered Simon, "and then pitched me over its head when he'd go no further." "Say not so," said the owner. "That horse has never been other than gentle with man, woman, and child." "Well, 'tis the last time you can say that," was Simon's reply as he dismounted, "because he's turned vicious today." "Well, if he hath," said the owner, he's been bewitched, for vice is beyond his nature." "Have it as thou wilt," said Simon. "Anyway, I give thee hearty thanks for the loan of him." And shaking hands with the citizen, he took his leave, rejoining his wife and children at their lodgings in the city. Now, it hadn't been a propitious visit to his native place. I mean, there were people who call it ominous, but Simon wasn't greatly concerned at his adventure. He described the site of the house to his family and promised them an outing there. He told his boys how they would learn to catch pike in the pool and entertained them with stories of English country life as he'd formerly known it. And he was sure of obtaining the land because he'd learnt that Perivale, to whom it belonged, and that the owner was not only willing to sell, but anxious to be rid of it. There seems to be no reason why they should not be installed there in a new house before the winter. The negotiations, when the time came for entering upon them, were entirely successful, and a substantial and roomy house was designed. And in the early spring, the materials were conveyed to the site and building began. The house was set with its greater rooms facing southward, some 50 yards from the pike pool, whose overhanging trees would make it an agreeable feature for the gardens in the rear. The enrichment of the house front was secured by a handsome doorway with a portico in the Italian style and a short flight of marble steps, which Simon had purchased from a thriftless nobleman who had begun to build and then was not able to finish. It promised to be a house worthy of a man of consequence, and Simon was well content, while his wife and children were impatient for its completion and the commencement of their country life in England. Meanwhile, the day arrived upon which they were all to visit the place. A coach was obtained and well horsed, in which they drove out of Cheapside under a blazing sun, with Simon in advance on horseback. He took the children on his saddle by turns, and they made a merry party, upon which the passers-by looked with envy. They went at such speed as the road allowed through the villages of Kensington, Acton, and Ealing, and they reached Greenford at noon, overjoyed after a winter spent in the city to be out in the open fields. With strict injunctions to the little ones about the dangers of the pool and a caution to the waiting women who attended them, Mistress Coston dismissed these to roam about at their pleasure, while she herself listened to Simon's discourse upon the house. I do not like the pool so near, said the lady, as they stood to look over the garden. It hath the look of deep water. Well, thou'lt like the fish well enough, answered Simon. As for the pool, I shall set a strong paling about it. Weren't thrown from my horse near here? His wife asked, as her eye wandered towards the farther part of the field. Come and see, said her husband. Having led her to the place, he described his former struggle with the horse and the unaccountable slime upon his hand. And together, having no other employment for the moment, they examined the ground again for a wet hole, but found the turf, as Simon had found it before, completely sound and unbroken. It seemed a matter of no great importance, and they soon desisted. But the recollection of that slime on his hand and of its putrid smell revived the feeling of disgust in Simon, and he associated it unpleasantly with his new house, Coston House, as he determined to call it. And at that moment, a shrill scream startled both parents. They turned hastily in the direction of the sound to see their little daughter Philippa, partly running and partly sliding at a great pace towards the pool, in the direction of the deepest water. I mean, there was no such slope of the ground as would account for her speed, and yet her shrieks proved that it was beyond her control. A few moments, and she must be over the edge. I mean, Simon and his wife darted forward, a useless movement at that distance, whilst the child rushed unaccountably to her certain destruction. Go back! Go back! Shouted her parents, and then, with a cry of relief, they saw the waiting woman dart across and pull the child onto the ground within 5 yards of the water's edge. And there lay both of them, panting and trembling, when Coston and his wife reached the spot. What is it, child? What are you doing? My hand went cold, said Philippa, and it pulled me along. Her mother took the hand as the child drew it from under her, and then hurriedly dropped it. Simon saw and smelt the slime, which he would have liked to forget. And again he searched in vain for its source. Mistress Coston, meanwhile, with all the grimaces of one performing a nauseous office, wiped her daughter's hand and soothed her as best she could. Well, the day's pleasure, of course, was at an end, and the return to the city was no longer delayed. Mistress Coston broke the silence at intervals by the repetition of her first remark. I like not that pool. I like it not. Now, if the building of the house had not proceeded so far already, perhaps Simon would have pleased his wife by changing the site. But the portico was erected, and also the southern front of the house up to its level. I mean, it was too late to change things now. Poor Philippa's fright was more than a child of 9 could bear without injury, and she needed careful nursing for many days. Sleeping or waking, she continually rehearsed her flight towards the pond, crying out, "I can't stop," or "Let me go," or "My hand is bitter cold." And yet before this trouble was over, there came another. The builder arrived one morning in the city, greatly distressed, to report that his foundations had failed. The marble steps had first begun to sink and slide backwards, and then the whole of the southern front. Now Simon chafed both at the delay and the expense. But after considering the matter, he dispatched his builder to Huntingdon, bearing a letter to a certain Dutchman whom Stephen knew to be engaged in draining the fens and to be skilled in building on unstable soil. A week later, this Dutchman, Cornelius van Hoog, came to London and was conducted at once to Greenford. And he made light of the difficulty, showing the builder how to relay his foundations under elm trunks laid in the clay. And he gave assurance that they would remain immovable under any weight applied to them thereafter. After some rebuilding, therefore, and no great delay, the house proceeded, and by the end of the summer, it was near completion. It was ready by Michaelmas. The autumn had been fine and dry, and the family took up their abode in it early in the month of October. And it was indeed a noble house, spacious and beautiful. Simon beheld it with satisfaction and no little pride. And when the furniture and fittings required no more attention, he set himself to consider the garden, in which up until that point very little work had been done. His first step was to summon one Peter Dwight, who had been commended to him on account of his skill as a gardener. A hale and vigorous man of some 60 years presented himself to learn what was wanted of him. "Canst undertake it?" asked Simon when he had unfolded his plans. "Being where it is no work for a decent Christian man, and I cannot," was the reply. "Being where it is," said Simon. "What means by that? So I take it that my garden is as good as that of another man." "No other man's garden stands by the bottomless pit," replied Master Dwight, "which folk have shunned this 20 years or more, not without good reason neither. Thou'rt a bold man, Simon Coston, and as some of us know, that wert a bold lad. But boldness avails thee nothing against the powers of darkness." "What old wives' tales are bemusing thy wits now?" said Simon in some heat. "One would take thee for a mindless thing with thy bottomless pits and thy powers of darkness." Peter Dwight coloured with anger at the taunt, but he continued to speak respectfully and without any other show of resentment. "Canst remember Dame Giggs, Master Coston?" "Yes, I remember her well enough. She was swum for a witch." "Aye, in that pool yonder, and clutched out of a sheet as ever she touched the water." What meanst thou, clutched? Who clutched her? Who? Why, those who inhabit the waters under the earth. Else why was her body never found? Well, doubtless it lies at the bottom of the pool now. What remains of it? I tell thee that pool hath no bottom," rejoined Dwight. "It is but the neck and mouth of the lower waters, where lives the beast that in the end shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, as Revelation saith, and go into perdition. Dame Giggs lives with the lost, as all the witches must, but her threats overhang thee, Simon Coston, and thou art playing with worse than fire to come near her again." "This is no talk for grown men," said Coston. "Let me hear no more of this." Notwithstanding, he could not but recollect what he'd seen crawl out of the pond after the swimming, and he was less easy in his mind than he had been. "Well, answered Dwight. I've had my say. Thy garden is like to the vale of Siddim that was full of slime pits, and thy pool goes down to the same underworld. If thou art seeking a gardener, thou must find another than me, but 'twill be a hard thing to do. The man took his leave, but he had uttered a word of ill savour to Simon. The recollection of slime troubled him as Dwight's last speech revived it. And for many days he couldn't shake off the unpleasant impression that this conversation had left. A large house, however, is a solid object and unaffected by impressions. With such a sign of his power and stability to encourage him, Coston soon recovered his confidence. As for the pool, he decided if need should rise, then he would fill it in. I mean, it would destroy his fish store, but it would be some compensation to end the talk about it having no bottom and to show his contempt for the dangers of which Peter Dwight had warned him. Mistress, Coston, and the children, the local talk had not yet reached, and Simon was too wise to mention it. It was the middle of November that he rode one day into Uxbridge and returned to find the house in confusion and sorrow. His son, Henry, a boy of 8, had tired of his play indoors and slipped away from the other children to go out upon some pursuit of his own. He had been missed and sought by his mother and the children's maid in the dusk of the afternoon, not at first by the pool, which was forbidden to him, but in such other places as were frequented by the children. Only when these failed did the searchers come to the pool. And the boy was there, sprawled upon the ground by the water's edge, with one arm wrapped round the trunk of a young willow, and the other plunged into the water, as if he were feeling about for some object that had attracted his interest. His mother called him, loudly and cheerfully, so that he might not think her angry, but he paid no heed. Only when they came near to him did they first suspect and then discover that the boy was dead and cold. His face lay just below the surface of the water, and when they drew out the arm that was immersed, they found that it was covered with an odious slime, which Mistress Coston had seen before. Now, the death of a boy, of course, must be pitiful to no matter whom. To parents, it is a most grievous sorrow, and so it was to Simon. But he said nothing to his wife of the cause that he had for feeling a measure guilty. To himself he said that, although he feared not a rat, it was not amiss to stop its hole, and with great sorrow and self-reproach that he'd not done it sooner, he began to collect materials for the filling up of the pool. I mean, the loss of his boy was irreparable, but he would at least protect the others against such a fate. The family, therefore, greatly overcast by the loss of one of its brightest members, impatiently awaited the filling up of the pool, and in the meantime avoided it. I mean, otherwise, the house proved to be a pleasant habitation, and not so far from London as to prevent the interchange of visits. Simon's stout carriage, with its pair of smart horses, was often upon the road, and the hospitality of his new house was attractive to his friends. The loss of Henry had disposed them to spend a quiet Christmas at home, but upon the last day of the month, they agreed to entertain 2 merchant friends of Simon's with their families, who were to spend the night at Coston House and return to the city the following day. And they enjoyed at least something of the mirth of the season. At the parting of the years, they wished each other joy with the happy ceremonies sanctioned by custom, and thereupon retired to their chambers with a general good night. The night, however, was less good than they'd hoped for. It proved, in fact, to be a strange night for everyone. After a bare hour of sleep, Simon awoke with a sense of movement that left him clutching at his curtains, at least with a hand that his wife was not clutching in her turn. At the same time, the crockery on the washing stand fell to the floor, and there followed a sound of more breaking crockery, the whinnying of horses in the stable, and the cries of children from various parts of the house. In little more than a moment, Simon was out of bed and out of his room, Mistress Costin, with the intent to reach her children, being close upon him. And they found their guests all at their doors and all in a similar state of alarm. Now, one of the merchants who had travelled in the Levant was certain of an earthquake, and he counselled them all to leave the house and make for the open. "Methinks it will prove somewhat too open for our ladies," said Simon. "I mean, the climate of Greenford in January is not that of the Levant. No, let it suffice that we return to the lower rooms and mix another bowl." Well, that advice was taken. The fires were revived, and the anxiety of everybody wore off as the night advanced without any further signs of danger. And finally, the household and guests returned to their chambers. The assemblage at a late breakfast on the morrow showed that nobody was the worse, and the guests took the road in better spirits at 11 of the forenoon. There'd been no earthquake, of course. I mean, Simon's thought to revert it at once, as will be supposed, to the elm trunks laid down by the advice of Cornelius Van Hoog, and he had but to walk around the house to find that, yes, indeed, it had slipped backwards without moving from its foundation over some 2 feet of ground. I mean, the matter was serious enough, and Simon had spent so much of his capital in building the house that he was annoyed at the prospect of having to spend more. He debated with himself whether he should simply leave things as they were or seek the advice of Van Hoog again. I mean, the house appears to be none the worse for its slide, and it threatens no further movement. But in the end, he decided that he would take horse to Huntingdon and lay the matter before his friends, to be dealt with or left alone, as he might suggest, summoning his own builder in the meantime to come and inspect the place. He said nothing to alarm his wife, but he only announced a few days' absence, such as was not unusual, and gave rise to no more than commonplace questions. The journey to Huntingdon took 3 days, and Van Hoog listened to the story on the next day following. He heard it with surprise, and when Simon had convinced him of its truth, he declared that they must ride back together. He would examine the ground and the structure for himself, and then decide what should be done. The two friends therefore set out next day, and on the next but one afterwards had reached St Albans, within a day's ride of Coston House. And there, at the Crown, Simon found his builder, who had come out in the hope of meeting him. Now that he'd succeeded, however, he seemed to have no words to say. "Is it by chance that we meet thus, or by design?" asked Simon. "As it chances, by design," answered the builder confusedly. "I had somewhat to say about the house, but I know not where to begin." "I'll begin at the beginning, of course," said Simon. "How dost thou account for the movement of it?" "It is the work of the devil and naught else," said the builder, crossing himself piously. "From a sensible man, that is not the answer that I looked for." "Hath the house moved again?" asked Van Hoog. "It is past moving any more," said the builder, and buried his face in his sleeve, overcome with emotion. "Oh, God, what folly is this? That a man weeps because his walls have shifted? Well, I lay no blame on thee, man, nor ever did." The builder looked up again, but not at Simon. "Tell him," he said to Van Hoog, that the house is gone. Gone? What? Gone where? Talk reason, man. The builder made no reply, but crossed himself once more. But my wife and children, shouted Simon. The builder shook his head. It was Van Hoog who patiently extracted the story. The man had made his way to Greenford upon Simon's summons to find the house, according to a group of bystanding villagers, had disappeared in the night with all that were in it. A portion of a wooden bedstead bearing Simon and his wife's monogram floated on the pool, and a few foundations were left around the site, but all else had vanished, sucked down into the bottomless pit, the villagers had said. The builder, therefore, had set out to break the news. Well, the travellers bespoke fresh horses and rode in haste to Greenford, and they found only what confirmed the builder's story. The whole site was pulpy. A few heaps of brickwork lay at the edges. The bedstead, which floated on the pool, was Simon's own, and nothing else was to be seen. Come away, said Van Hoog to Simon. It's an evil place. Go where you will, he said. I stay here. He would yield to no persuasion, and the darkness was coming on. They told him, therefore, of an inn at Kensington where they would await him with a supper prepared, and with a last injunction that he should not fail them, they rode away. Left alone, Simon paced to and fro about the pool. The last of the villagers left the spot while it was still light and finished the day in the safer region of the load of hay. But Simon noticed their departure no more than he had noticed their presence. My wife, my children, my house, he repeated again and again as he paced about in the darkness. What was that which startled his horse, tied by a bridle to the willow? The constable averred the next day that he heard the animal shriek and then saw it leap the ditch and pass him at a gallop down the lane. He'd gone as near to the scene of the disaster as he dared, and that is what he heard and saw. Early the next morning, however, Peter Dwight and another saw a man prone on the ground and feeling for something, as it seemed, in the pond. They went up to the place, and they found Simon Coston cold and dead, with one arm around a young tree and his face in the water. The hand, which seemed to be feeling in the water, came out as they drew the body away, covered with a quivering oily slime, so offensive to the sight that neither would touch it. They let it fall upon the turf, and they were met soon afterwards, running down the lane as if for their very life, and would stop to answer no question. Later on, after some days had passed, and the memory of the adventure was softened, Peter Dwight told how the slimy hand had reached again towards the pool, and how the body, now that the other arm was disengaged from the tree, had followed it until it had gone rapidly under with a sucking noise, which was the last sound they heard as they turned their backs and fled. Now, the story now takes a great leap of not less than 2 centuries. The Coach and Six, albeit a new building in these days, is still the favourite of idlers. And a group of these, upon a certain summer afternoon, are teasing and questioning the village idiot, a young man of 25 who carries a coloured whip. "Come here, Billy," says one of the group, "and tell us when you went to bed last night." "Billy went to bed last night when the cock crew this morning," he gravely answers. "Where did you go, Billy?" asks another, "before you went to bed?" "Billy went down Coston Lane to see Simon and the Witch." "How often have you seen them?" 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, says Billy. "Tell us what they do," says another. It's evidently a well-known catechism. "Simon walks about like this and says, 'My wife, my children, my house.' Witch comes dripping wet and laughs at him like this." And Billy imitates a weird and horrible laugh. Now, the story is attested by others than the idiot, but in their case, cautiously and fearfully. I mean, what to the vacant mind of Billy accepts as entertainment is to the occasional benighted wayfarer a truly horrible experience. I mean, the pool remains unfilled and perhaps has defied many attempts to fill it. The small remains of Coston House lie on the ground overgrown with turf. But on dark nights, even when Billy has been beguiled to his bed with sweetmeats, and fear has kept the lane free of wayfarers, there will rise suddenly a noisy commotion of owls and nightbirds, which proclaim to the villagers as they turn in their beds that the presence and voices of Simon and the Witch have broken the stillness. The half-awakened sleeps well know the scene that is being enacted, and they rejoice that they are safely abed. Some there are who will cross themselves and pray for the repose of those 2 wandering souls. The more part, as they compose themselves to sleep again, vaguely wonder, how long will the ghosts walk? I mean, it is agreed that they must walk until the pool is filled in. But when one or another asks how a pit may be filled in when it has no bottom, the question remains unanswered.